Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Generative AI Teach Out Live Q&A. My name is Melissa McCurry, and I am a learning experience designer at the University of Michigan's Center for Academic Innovation. I'll be your moderator for today's event. This live event brings together 4 unique voices to help us gain a better understanding of the current landscape of generative artificial intelligence and what an AI-integrated future could look like for business, education, authorship, and beyond. We can also learn more about how these powerful technologies can be used in our daily lives. The Generative AI Teach-Out is still live on Coursera, so please feel free to jump in and engage with our community of global learners. You can find the link in the chat now. I want to thank everyone who has already submitted questions in the teach-out and in the event registration. During this live session today, we invite you to submit additional questions for our panelists in the Zoom Q&A section, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. Feel free to upvote questions from other participants. Given our limited time, we ask that you keep your questions related to the topic. As we bring together this diverse community in discussion, we also ask that you be respectful of our speakers and other learners as you engage with this event and the teach-out. Please note that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded to the teach-out in Coursera afterwards. I'd also like to point out that the closed captions have been enabled, and you may need to press the CC button on the bottom of your Zoom window to view the transcript. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our panelists for today. Dr. Kurt Skiffstad is the Executive Director of the Center for Entrepreneurship at the University of Michigan. Dr. Matias Del Campo is an Associate Professor of Architecture at the University of Michigan's Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. Dr. Ying Zhu is an Assistant Professor of Learning Sciences and Technology at the Marshall Family School of Education at the University of Michigan. And Dr. Anhang Guo is an Assistant Professor of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, as well as an Assistant Professor of Information at the University of Michigan. So thank you all for joining us today. Let's jump into our Q&A. To begin, I'd like to ask each of you to give a brief introduction of your work and your research and how it involves generative AI. Kurt, could you please start us off?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. As Melissa said, my name is Kurt Skiffstad. I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Entrepreneurship at the university. My interests are in the commercialization of generative AI and how it will change how we do business and how we work together. This kind of builds on 30 years of commercializing AI technology coming out of places like the University of Michigan and other laboratories.
Matthias, would you like to go next?
Sure. So the main focus related to AI in my work is with the Laboratory for Architecture and Artificial Intelligence at Taubman College called ARIEL. That is an interdisciplinary laboratory between computer science, data science, robotics, and architecture, which brings together those disciplines to find novel solutions for architectural problems that can reach from very pragmatic problems like automated plan making, optimization of structures, to the discovery of cultural meanings within these new tool sets.
And then Ying, would you like to go next?
Sure. So I'm in the School of Education. So I do research on using AI to facilitate teaching and learning. I am particularly interested in developing AI to serve as children's conversation partners to see whether and how children could learn through having back and forth conversations with AI.
I'm Anhang Guo. I'm an assistant professor in computer science and engineering and also school of information. So our work kind of related to generative AI, there are 2 different directions. One that we are mostly focusing on is on accessibility. So how can we use AI and generative AI techniques to make the world more accessible for people with visual impairment, to increase the communication bandwidth for people with communication needs, as well as there's a separate direction on how do we leverage these new tools for immersive authoring in virtual reality environments.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for those introductions. It sounds like you're all doing very interesting research. And thank you again for being here today. For attendees who haven't yet taken the Generative AI Teach Out, let's begin with a basic understanding of what Generative AI is. So this first question is for Kurt. How does generative artificial intelligence work?
Melissa, that's a big question. Just for some context, AI has been around for quite some time, and the uses we've seen in our lives have been more what we would call analytic applications of AI, things like figuring out what the best therapies would be for a patient given their current comorbidities, or understanding the optimal route through traffic in real time for your GPS system, or financial systems, stock trading, and other things like this. Generative AI is new and exciting because it's about creating new content based on prompts from a user, and really is opening the door to new types of creativity. Essentially, this is an information technology. It's information in and information out. And some people refer to generative AI as very fancy autocomplete functionality, but it's much, much more than that. Because of the sophistications of these systems, they have the ability to work at a very high degree of subtlety and fidelity with the information at a conceptual level. Some people say, so you can say generate a prose in the style of Shakespeare, or you could generate computer code in Python language, or you could generate haiku based on a simple text prompt. You can also prompt systems to generate music or other types of digital media. We've all seen imagery coming from DALL-E or Midjourney based on text prompts. And so it creates very sophisticated new content based on prompts from the user at a very impressive level of detail and sophistication.
Thank you, Kurt. That was a really helpful overview. And then as a follow-up question, learners are interested in knowing more about training, because there's a lot of talk about training in generative AI. So what does this training look like, and how are generative AI systems trained?
Yeah, this is really, kind of the excitement of looking back, 30 years ago when I graduated from the AI lab here. We were dealing with big data sets that were trivial in size compared to what we have now. And essentially, a key part of the generative AI revolution is that we have massive, massive amounts of data available on the internet, in particular, that is labeled and associated with different concepts. So these systems take this digitized content. You can think of blog posts and news articles and captions for images and tags on pictures on Pinterest and other things to correlate that information and create a very, very sophisticated model that allows you to predict what a text input would be relevant. So it's all about the data with these systems and being able to use massive amounts of data to create very, very complex models, which can be then used to generate new content. You think of imagery of red, green, and blue pixels creating color imagery. These systems, these generative systems, are not looking at 3 dimensions. They're looking at, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of dimensions in a almost incomprehensible space, where they're making decisions to decide what is the next piece of information, the next pixel on the image being created, or the next note of music that is being created, or the next phrase in the haiku. And it's really quite fascinating. But the data, it comes back to very, very, very large data repositories that are crawled over and over again by these systems to train them and create the models.
Thank you, Kurt. It's always so interesting to hear about how the models are trained and the large amounts of data that are put into the models. Switching gears to our next question, this one is for Matthias. If everyone begins to use AI to enhance their work, how do you maintain some level of individuality and authenticity in your work while using AI for enhancing?
That's a good question. But actually, it's not a new question. That question always shows up when a new technology comes up. So I think that no matter if you're using a brush and oil paint or a photographic camera or AI, you always have to find a way of how to express yourself through that sort of tool. Because at the end of the day, it's another tool, right? Artificial intelligence. There's one main difference between the tools we used so far in any form of artistic production and AI, is that artificial intelligence can learn, which previous tools did not do. But this can be also used as an advantage for an artist, because it again, we are here with the word mentioned before and explained by Dr. Skiffstad, which is training. You can actually train your own data sets. You can train your own neural networks, for example, with your own data and so on. This is also a form of creativity. Like, what do you use? How do you use it? You can intentionally, for example, avoid really robust curve fitting, creating really strange results, which create a novel form of aesthetics that you as an artist can use as something that is uniquely yours. So there is a variety of ways and methods and ideas and techniques where you can exploit even AI to expand your abilities as an artist.
Well, one quick thing I saw in the news that OpenAI just enabled like ChatGPT, GPT 3.5 fine-tuning capability for individual users. So that's really exciting.
To follow on, I 100% agree with what Matthias was saying. I think it's not that creativity is going away. I think there'll be an explosion of creativity with these new and really powerful tools.
Yeah, that's wonderful to see. And I really appreciate hearing about AI and the advantages of AI, because I think in the beginning, there was a lot of concern about AI and a lot of negativity surrounding it. So it's really good to hear like the positive impacts of AI. So moving on to our next question, it's on a related note about authenticity. Ying, we've gotten a lot of questions about the role and impact of generative AI tools in education. What will or what should generative AI change about the skills we seek to teach in our classrooms?
Yeah, thank you. This question is indeed kind of related to Matthias' question just now. So there are a lot of discussions going on right now, and the general consensus, I would say, is that it is essential to balance the acquisition of foundational skills with some sort of AI literacy. So I'm going to expand on that a little bit. So first, certain foundational skills are still irreplaceable. It is especially true in elementary and middle schools, where we want students to learn how to do things on their own so that they could later become more effective users of AI tools that will become available to them. So a good analogy would be the calculator. So even with calculators available, arithmetic remains a crucial skill because it lays the foundations for students to learn math in the future. So similarly, for generative AI like ChatGPT, it could be a valuable brainstorming partner or editor, but it cannot evaluate its own output. So solid foundational skills like analytical thinking, organization, adaptability to different audiences are still very necessary so that the students can critique and refine what ChatGPT produces. But beyond foundational subject matter knowledge and skills, we also need to teach students how they could leverage AI to enhance their applications of their skills. So when considering ChatGPT, the quality of its answers largely depends on how you prompt it. So this is a skill that we should equip students with. However, I do want to kind of differentiate between teaching specific prompting strategies versus providing a broader understanding of AI to enable students to adapt to the ongoing changes. So both aspects are important, but the latter is kind of gaining significance because of the rapid evolution of large language models. So in fact, I remember there is a study that compared GPT-4's behaviors over the course of a few months and found that even with the same prompt, the quality of its output varied. So if we just have students to memorize fixed prompts without introducing them to the underlying logic, it might not be as beneficial to help them keep up with kind of the really dynamic nature of AI.
Thank you, Ying. I think that's such an important part, that we have to teach critical thinking and those strategies, like you said. And now moving on to our next question. This one is for Anhong. How does generative AI impact people with disabilities? So for instance, we had a learner say that they were totally blind, but they were interested in knowing how they can utilize AI.
Thanks for the question. So in my lab, we do a lot of work at the intersections of AI and generative AI and accessibility. So I would say there are both positives and negatives that we should think about. On the positive side, these new machine learning and artificial intelligence capability have huge potential in making the world more accessible, such as creating personal assistants to describe the visual content, such as images, videos, as well as in the real world. I think that is still a very hard, challenging problem that existing generative AI or AI models do not do very well, right? So as an example, there is a company called Be My Eyes, which is a service that pairs sighted volunteers and blind users to answer questions through a video stream. And they released the capability, a collaboration with OpenAI, so that blind users can upload a photo and then is able to ask questions and have a conversation with this photo, basically. So I think that is very exciting. And I think a lot of users are benefiting from that. But I think we should really move towards being able to have a continuous camera stream that's able to observe what's happening in the real world and be able to have the user dynamically query and request information in real time. So I think we're still pretty far from that. So that's kind of one of the example of a positive of how these new tools can make the world more accessible. However, there are also a lot of considerations that can things that can go wrong that we should pay attention to. For example, related to what Ying said, depending on how people prompt these models, the model's output will be very different. So we are not sure how ChatGPT will say about a person with disability, or how they will describe, someone with disability, maybe using stereotypical languages and inadvertently create, other harm through this process. So although there has been a lot of techniques to add filters and make sure things are not inappropriate things are being output, but that in fact create other problems. For example, there has been a case where someone with ALS want to ask for a cigarette, and the generative these large language model think cigarette is something that's not safe, so you just prevented that person from saying that word. So that's a kind of a very interesting case. And another case is these data are for example, there has been standard this research on how should we describe human, right? So should we describe their gender or appearance or race? So there are a lot of considerations there, but this actually heavily depends on where you are in the world, right? Are you in the Western culture or in a different part of the world? Actually, people have very different preferences. So how do we enable these kind of customization while still considering safety? And also, as a side note, so we have been talking a lot about kind of large language models like ChatGPT, but the other like image generation models, for example, if you think about them, they are not currently accessible for people with visual impairment, right? So there has been some ongoing research on how to make that happen.
Maybe just a quick follow-up on Anhong's comment, because I think this is super exciting and interesting. Specifically, if you use large language models in order to describe, for example, the environment to a blind person, there is one particular problem that is still present, which is that these large language models very often hallucinate still things, and thus are just giving false information, even if it sounds completely convincing. So this is like one of the dangers that I see in these models, is that they can create things that sound completely plausible and reasonable, but are far away from the truth. And thus actually creating like a vision of an environment that does not exist for this blind person. So I don't know how this will impact them, apart from things that are like dangerous. If the model like says it's green, but in fact the light is red to walk over the street. I know that this is just a matter of training and of larger data sets and so on, and it will improve, that's for sure. But at the moment, there's still a lot of hallucination going on.
Yeah, that's a very important consideration. So at the intersection of AI and explainability, and we had one work on like by providing touch exploration for blind users to explore image in detail, they're able to make more informed decisions on whether the automatic generated caption is correct or not. So in this case, for example, imagine there's a virtual assistant that's observing the real world, that's telling the user what's happening, and there might be things that are hallucinated. Then we should, for example, one technique from the more algorithmic side is we can add a bunch of other like existing computer vision models that are more explainable to kind of check, what are the objects that you see, whether there are things that exist in this, what this generative model is producing, and then cross-checking that and maybe like communicating that uncertainty better to the user, although there are also challenges in understanding that uncertainty level and things like that.
Yeah, just another quick follow-up, because we work with really young children, sometimes just preschool age children. So we think about this safety issue a lot. So one approach we've been using is keeping the human in the loop approach. So when children interact with generative AI, so we keep the parents and the teachers in the loop so that they could kind of filter out the information they probably don't want the child to be exposed to. Yeah, so there are so many different kind of mechanisms, what level of flexibility and automation that we want to include in the AI system that we need to research on.
Thank you, En-Hong, Matthias, and Ying. That's such an interesting conversation, and definitely one for all of us to consider as the technology continues to develop. Being mindful of time, we're going to switch gears and move to our live questions from our audience today. And as we shift to these questions, I want to emphasize that a lot of these great questions are being discussed in our teach out, and we hope that you'll take the time to join the teach out live on Coursera. So now, with our remaining time together, let's move to these questions. One learner asks, as a professor, how do you introduce generative AI to your students? For example, generative AI can be quite daunting at first glance. And how do you envision your students' use of GAI? Students are using GAI to help them write essays. Do you think this is harmful or developing their critical thinking?
Yes, so much in that. We just had obviously I've had a lot of conversations within the college about the implications of generative AI in the classroom, and how the individual instructor determines whether it can or should be used, and in what ways, and how should the student be sharing that they're using that. Do you use it as a cited source, or do you use it as a co-author, if you will? And the reality is students are going to use these technologies. They have been using it. Certainly, talking to students last semester, right after the ChatGPT was made public, they were using these technologies, and it is a tool that we all need to learn and understand how they fit in different contexts. And there are pros and cons, but the reality is it's here, and it's up to us to figure out how to make the best use of it. I think it comes back to something that Ying said. I think is that at the key, we need to teach our students to be critical thinkers, and these tools are ways to add more content to the workflow, if you will, but it doesn't absolve them or us of the the responsibility to understand the core, teach the core concepts, and show it's a new world. How does a student demonstrate competency or mastery of a set of concepts in the world of generative AI? And so we need to be creative as well.
I have maybe a different perspective to the problem because, I mean, I'm not a computer scientist. I'm not a data scientist. I'm an architect. And architecture is this strange animal somewhere between technology and art, the humanities and technology. So we need to find a way how to wiggle ourselves into the conversation about AI. And one of the first things I try to do when, also we started doing this sort of like design ideas with AI before the rise of GAI in the last 1 or 2 years. So we have been doing this before that. The method, how to teach it, didn't change so much because of GAI. Because one of the most important things for me, once I start with new students who have never worked with AI before and have no idea about programming or scripting or anything like that, is trying to demystify AI first, like trying to make them understand it's not magic. It's a technology. It has certain tools, and it has like, here's a diagram. That's how it actually works. Yeah. Just trying to take away the anxiety that a lot of students have today in regards to this like overarching giant thing that is in front of us now, which is AI. Now, specifically when it's about GI, like generative AI. By the way, the models we've been talking about, like the image generators and text generators, these are not the first generative AI models out there. There have been tools before that. GAN was one of those. StyleGAN was basically a generative tool, right? So it just became bigger because of the data sets that are being used. But at the end of the day, like trying to show them that, oh, it's actually just a machine where you inverse the flow of information to, instead of being analytical, being generative, for example. Yeah. So if you take all the things into account, you can very quickly create like a critical atmosphere where students are going to hopefully be more critical towards the tool and also recognize when it is useful to use it and maybe when not. You don't have to do everything with AI if you can do it differently, more effectively. But also on the other hand, what is very important for me, again, talking from the perspective of rather the artist as an architect, is really the cultural implications of what does it mean when we use it, and how does it affect us as humans and the human condition? How do we reflect on it? And then how does that reflect on the output we do with it? So the critical interrogation of the toolset is for sure one of the most important parts of moving ahead when it is about pedagogy.
Yeah, thank you, Kurt and Matthias. And now our next question is asking, can you clarify the difference between generative AI and predictive AI? Are these independent classes, or is there some significant overlap between these AI types? Is this distinction important to better understand the concept?
I'm sure anybody wants to take that one. These semantic arguments are always fun to get into. Yeah, I think there are classes of tools called predictive AI, and what we're talking about now is called generative AI. I think there are different use cases and historical, in particular, systems that were more in the class of analytical solutions. But it's not something I would spend a tremendous amount of time trying to understand. It's a semantic argument to me. I'm happy to hear more, learn more from my peers, though.
If I can add to that, because I think it's a super interesting question, by the way. I mean, there's two things that AI, generally speaking, can do really well. One is optimization, and then the other one is prediction. This is like the two main areas where AI can really excel. The generative AI tools we're seeing are primarily optimizing. They're optimizing along a Markov chain in response to one of your prompts, for example. So, by the way, which does mean also that it does not necessarily produce the best result. It just produces the optimized results towards a specific question, which sometimes is not the optimum, by the way. It's kind of an interesting, yes, I know it's semantics. And I agree with Curtis, it's all semantic problems here. But at the end of the day, those are like philosophical questions that are really worth thinking about, I think. Because it turns, for example, if I talk as an architect again, it's turning some of our beliefs as architects on the head, right? Because when we in architecture talk about optimization, we talk about the minimum amount of material that I can use, the maximum support I can create with the minimum amount of structure, like these sort of things. Yeah, the maximum use of space within a building. Yeah, these are like very clear, very pragmatic, logical steps that you can take. Now we have a tool that might optimize in a direction which is maybe not the minimum amount of material to be used in a building, but it improves the living standard in it, right? So there's like these trade-offs that happen, which are not necessarily completely logical, but sometimes they're really useful. Yeah. I don't know if I can explain clearly what I'm trying to say here. What I just said is probably just an entire paper worth of writing about it, but I think it's an interesting problem.
I think it goes back to what you said a few minutes ago, Matthias. I think the key for all of us is to demystify these tools, because they're tools. They're not magic. They're we probably all remember the first time we saw an image generated by DALL-E and seeing the near photorealistic imagery generated by a text prompt, and that great quote about the sufficiently advanced technology being indistinguishable from magic. This isn't magic. But it is very sophisticated, very impressive, very complicated technology. But for us to understand how to work with it most effectively, we need to demystify it. And for everyone out in the world, these are tools that can be used for different classes of problems, and that's going to be really fun to watch play out over the next months and years as we understand more and more and understand how these things really fit, because there's a lot here.
Yeah, so this is super interesting discussion. I learned a lot from just hearing the discussion as well. So in our research, we kind of use this both generative AI and predictive AI kind of differently. So I hope I have a kind of easy to understand example. So when we use predictive AI, so we kind of use how students talk to their parents, talk to the teachers to kind of predict their language ability to see how much they might grow in a near future. So this is how we use predictive AI. So for generative AI, so how we use it is that we build a kind of AI chatbot that could generate response or generate questions that it could ask students on the fly, and then also generate tailored feedback. So this is how I understand it from the context of education and how we use AI.
Thank you all. This is such an interesting discussion. And now our next question is about digital accessibility. So it sounds like our learners are interested in hearing more about the usage of AI in improving accessibility. And Hung, would you be able to speak more about this?
Yeah, so sort of applying AI more broadly for accessibility has been a pretty long field. Like, people have been doing a lot of work in this space. Generative AI, to me, is just a new kind of capability in here. And I think, for example, we had a recent project on how do we imagine making 360 videos accessible for blind and vision impaired people. For a traditional 2D video, there are things called audio descriptions that are kind of inserted between the gaps of the narration of the video to describe additional visual content. But when we try to apply that to 360 video, there are new challenges. Like, there are so many different directions, and it can have multiple storylines, etc. So we use AI techniques to detect objects, to track objects, and present that information to help someone who will describe the video to do a better job at it. So, related to what Ying said about human in the loop. So in that project, we're not completely having this AI to replace the human, but we put the AI suggestions in front of the human to help them do a better job. And we are also exploring, okay, what if we are introducing more automation? Then what do we need to do, and how do we put the end user in the loop as well? And one thing I think that we had in the earlier part of this discussion that strike me is I think there has been a lot of discussions of, okay, do we need to train people to know how to prompt these systems? And so is that the education problem, or is that I think fundamentally I think we should understand I think instead of trying to teach people how to interact with these AI systems, we should understand how human would like to interact with other human or interact with this tool, and understand what is the best way to solve a problem, to make a process for people to achieve their goal, and then we should adapt the technologies to do that. So I think rather than thinking about the technology or the capability as a fixed thing that human need to adapt or we need to understand and fix, alternative way is, okay, we can still influence how do we build these systems in the first place, through technical innovations, human-centered design to understand the goals and challenges and evaluation, as well as through regulatory measures.
Thank you. That was very helpful. And now our next question is going back to the applications in an educational setting. So ChatGPT has captured the national narrative, at least in higher education, but it's one of many. And I'm curious what other tools you all see as having a strong application in the college classroom. Now, I know, Ying, you're in the School of Education. So would you like to speak to this question?
Yeah, so this is a super interesting question. So I have been actually doing AI in classroom settings for a while before ChatGPT was released. And at that time, so AI seemed to be a more abstract concept to a lot of the teachers and students. When I asked them, how do you use AI in your classrooms? So a lot of them would ask me, so what do you mean by AI? So give me some examples of tools. And it was actually after ChatGPT, it gave teachers and students a really concrete example of what AI would look like and how AI might be used in a classroom. So I would give the panelists an opportunity to give specific examples. But for me, it's hard. So there are a lot of research developed AI tools that would have a more a focused application areas in classrooms. But it's hard for me to think of another tool that might capture as much discussions as generative AI or ChatGPT right now. So correct me if I'm wrong.
Can I follow up on that? I think this is a very interesting question. Like, there's two things I would really like to say before we finish here, which is on the one side, generative AI and the things we're discussing here, like ChatGPT or any form of diffusion model that generates images, is only a very, very small fraction of what AI can actually do. And I think the focus on this, only on those, might actually make us blind for other possibilities that exist with artificial intelligence that might be more useful. The other thing is that things like GPT is actually generative pre-trained transformers, right? And pre-trained is the main message here. I think when you use anything that is pre-trained, you're taking away the possibility to really train things according to your needs. So this is something people should learn, that anything that is pre-trained, there's possibilities for censorship, for example. I mean, we see this already in a lot of image generators. There's a lot of censorship in what you can prompt or cannot prompt. And the same is going to happen with all these language models. So doing so actually really impacts culture. It means that you can only do specific things because others are not allowed, right? So it's actually limiting your possibilities as creator through these models. But once you have learned how to use transformers, how do you create your diffusion model, how do you set these things up in Google Colab, you actually gain more freedom of actually doing things that might be more helpful for what you want to achieve, whether it's in education or in business or in medicine or whatever which area it is.
Thank you both for answering that question. It looks like our next question is directed at Kurt. Could you tell us more about the impact of generative AI in the financial industry, particularly in fintech?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the finance industry is one that has been using AI for a long time. I remember, working with some grad students back in the 90s who were, and it seemed like everybody from the lab was being recruited to Wall Street for building predictive models. There's that term again. It is a logical area where there's going to be a lot of impact. I am not a domain expert in fintech, but anytime you have large streams of information and large historical data to train from, there are going to be opportunities to gain insights and see some interesting results. I think it's like many information heavy domains in the business world. That's high return, high content, high value. I don't know what those specific solutions are going to be, but I know that's an area of great interest, and there are going to be some very interesting things happening.
Thank you, Kurt. And it looks like some of our learners are asking questions about the future of AI. So this first question is, what do you think will be the status quo of using generative AI in the future?
Well, I think these tools will just be more naturally integrated in our lives in many ways. I think there's, there are barriers that will have to be overcome, but being an optimist, I believe that'll be the case. As Matthias referenced a few minutes ago, these are all pre-trained solutions, so they're not reacting in real time to information in the world, and so bringing these approaches and this level of sophistication and subtlety to bear on real-time problems and we're going to have to get over the hurdles on those. But it's you look at this, the many ways we consume information today and how that's changed even in the past couple of decades, let alone the past couple of centuries. There's things will change and they'll seamlessly integrate into the way that we work, and they'll just be the natural tools that we use to go about our business.
I think maybe chances are high that we're not going to call it AI at all anymore. It's going to be, as Kurt correctly said, it's going to be integrated so well in our everyday life that we're not going to even think about it being some form of AI. And there's I think this is, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there is this term AI effect that already has been around since the 1970s, which basically described exactly the phenomenon that things are integrated so well, neural networks are integrated so well in existing software that you don't even notice anymore that it's a form of AI. The other thing is a couple of interesting things that might happen is, on the one side, yes, again, echoing what Kurt just said, in real-time training data set, in real-time training, that would be awesome. And the other one is, which I also think is quite interesting, is data-starved neural networks, meaning that they can learn faster with smaller data sets. Because the one of the things that is really problematic now for smaller users is a mass like these gigantic data sets. You have to be, you need to afford that, right? If you cannot afford that, you cannot start doing any form of training. But if we have algorithms that can learn much faster, and again, based on what you knew from neuroscience, because a toddler can learn really quickly what a dog is without having to see millions of them. Yeah. So how does that work? If we understand how that works, we can actually create algorithms that can learn much faster with way smaller data sets, which would give us a new level of using these sort of technologies in our environment.
Yeah, I think they're talking about that, like fine-tuning or transfer learning. These are terms before generative AI is hot. And I think and there are also new capabilities that I think we can also call generative AI. For example, I think Apple Accessibility had a feature where someone can, basically read sentences that the system, show up for maybe a couple of hours, and then you're able to generate a personal voice. So is that generative AI? I think so, right? So it's generating a new kind of voice using training data that you can provide, post hoc, to be able to basically generate a personalized model for this. And similarly for personalized ASR, like automatic speech recognition models, etc. And so to me, the status quo of using generative AI, I agree with the previous points from Matthias and Kurt is that, when and now I think is the raw capabilities thrown out into the world and people are figuring out what to do with it. And then developers will really have to understand what humans want, what are the problems humans want to be solved, and then really create that interface between this capability to match with the problem that we want to solve. So eventually this will just be part of many applications, just like what we have different apps that for our different needs, but the new kinds of applications that's able to kind of combine these capabilities with our existing routines. Like this is how we use apps, this is how we manipulate data, this is how we have routines in our lives and be able to learn from that and basically still focus on a set of key problems, but in new ways.
Thank you all for sharing your insights on that. And being mindful of the time, it looks like we will have time for just one more question. So our final question is, lots of people are wondering about how they can learn to utilize generative AI. And they're asking about specific courses or specific resources on how to do this. So how would you recommend our learners continue to learn about generative AI going forward?
If I may jump in quickly on this, I think it really depends on how you want to approach it. Do you want to approach it as purely as a user, or do you want to approach it as somebody who wants to develop or tinker around with it? This is two different levels of using it. As a user, I think the user interfaces these days for generative AI are so intuitive and so simple that you just need to start using it. Like image generators, for example, at least the ones where you don't have the ability to look under the hood. I'm not going to say any names now, yeah? They are closed systems. I've seen like their manuals, they're like 2 pages. So it's really easy and fast to learn it. And with things like ChatGPT, again, I think you need some form of intuition. So if you're able to write an essay or at least a little bit, you're going to have a rather easy time trying to figure out how to use it. I don't think there's like a lot of magic shortcuts that you can use in ChatGPT. I think if you really just use your normal language and try to explain in every way, shape, or form an idea, it will be able to produce something. Whether this is useful then at the end or not is again your own critical observation, right? And then the other end of the spectrum, you might, it might be useful for you to learn Python as a starting point. Might be maybe even useful to look a little bit into the mathematics behind it, because these are the building blocks of what's happening under the hood. Yeah. So if you want to change things under the hood, I think these are two good starting points. And also there's like a million YouTube videos with fantastic introductions of what's happening under the hood with these technologies that I can really recommend. I mean, I know Justin Johnson, one of our colleagues, he has an amazing YouTube series where he really explains the whole basics of it in a very easy way to understand, I think.
One of the wonders of social media is you can follow the thought leaders, at the big companies who are doing this work, and through clicking through the references they provide, very quickly get to, as technical or non-technical as you want. And a lot of folks like Jan LeCun and others are quite active, and that's how I stay on top of things, and just clicking through the tree of links there, and you get, and again, you can take a technical path or a high level path, and just through all the expected social media channels. And as Matthias said, there's some really great stuff out on YouTube and other platforms for high level overviews at whatever level of sophistication you want to go into it.
Just one sentence more about this. Just be warned, this can be a total rabbit hole.
Yes. But a lot of fun too.
Yeah, if you go onto Twitter these days, it's hard not to see anything about generative AI. Yeah, and this course is about the generative AI teach out, right? So this is definitely a good resource for that too.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, everyone. Ying, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
So final thoughts in terms of the learning resources, so the overall.
Yeah, learning resources.
Yeah, so I also found Twitter super helpful. So I'm from social science background. So on Twitter, I could find a lot of resources that is very accessible for people who do not have the technical background.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you again for joining us today. And a special thank you to Kurt, Matthias, Ying, and Anhong for your generosity and time. If you haven't already, please check out and share the Generative AI Teach Out live now on Coursera, where we discuss many aspects of generative AI, including the ethical and legal implications. I'll also note that we have over 40 other teach outs archived on Michigan Online that you can check out as well, and you can find the link in the chat now. Our content is available under a Creative Commons license and can be reused and shared with credit. And we hope to see you join the conversation.